تاريخ الفن في جامعة شمال تكساس منذ العام 2002. تدرس الثقافة البصرية العربية والفن الإسلامي. قاد المعرض الذي نسقته تحت عنوان دفاتر فن الكتاب العراقي المعاصر 2005-2007 إلى تطوير فن الكتاب أو ما يسمى دفاتر الرسم في العراق. لها العديد من المقالات والكتيبات التي تتناول المسؤولية القانونية والأخلاقية للتواجد الأمريكي على أرض العراق منذ العام 2003. دراستها الأخيرة التي نشرتها في العام 2007 بعنوان الفن العربي الحديث تشكيل الجماليات العربية تعد دراسة قيمة في الفن العربي منذ 1940 وحتى الوقت الحاضر. حصلت على منحة فولبرايت لتدريس مساق حول تاريخ الفن العربي المعاصر في الجامعة الأردنية بعمان. محاضرتنا اليوم الدكتورة ندى شبوط ستتحدث عن المعاصرة في الفن بالبلاد العربية، فلنرحب بها معا. نود التنويه فقط لأنه كان من المفترض أن يعرض اليوم فيلم إلى متى لآن ماري جاسر، لكن ولأسباب تتعلق بالمخرجة تم تأجيل الفيلم حتى الثلاثاء القادم وتقديم محاضرة الدكتورة ندى إلى اليوم. نعتذر عن هذا الإرباك في البرنامج لكن لظروف معينة. ونرحب معي بالدكتورة ندى شبوط. أهلا بكم.
شكرا كثير للتقديم اللطيف ولدارة الفنون لدعوتي اني استضافتي هون مشان القي الكلمه هاي ولحضوركم الكريم. بدي اعتذر من الاول انه البروجرام بيقول ان المحاضره بالعربي، بس انا اكتشفت انه كنت كثير متفائله لما فكرت انه ممكن اعطي المحاضره بالعربي. كمان كنت متفائله اني ممكن ادرس المواد اللي عم ادرسهم بالجامعه الاردنيه بالعربي، بس لقيت انه يعني هذا التفاؤل كان مش بمحله ومضطره اني يعني احكي اكثر بالانجليزي واجرب انه ادخل عربي مع الانجليزي. فبس اللي بيصير مثلا انه اذا يعني في اسئله معينه ممكن تسالوا الاسئله بالعربي وانا ممكن اجاوب عنها بالانجليزي، وبدكم تعذروني لانه كمان زي المتحدثين اللي قبلي صار لي 28 سنه انا عايشه برا، بفكر بالانجليزي واسهل لي او بنشر بالانجليزي، فصعب كثير اني احكي بالعربي. كمان في بحضورنا موجودين يعني غير متكلمين اللغه العربيه، انتوا اسهل تفهموا الانجليزي، هن مش رح يفهموا العربي. فيعني with this in mind I'm going to start my talk. وين مش عم بشوف، ممكن تفرجيني بس وين الانتر؟ ان شاء الله ما تبردوا كثير، يعني احنا متوقعين بدنا نكون فوق وادفى شوي. الانتر وين؟ لا هاي اوكي شكرا. Is contemporary Middle Eastern art the next big thing? This question was the topic of discussion of the conference organized by Art Tactic, an online research facility founded by former JP Morgan banker Andres Peterson, which publishes analysis of emerging markets of auction. There is no doubt that the world has finally discovered contemporary art from our region. Earlier in 2003, a statement written to introduce the exhibition Disorientation, Contemporary Arab Art from the Middle East, which was on view 20th of March to 11th of May 2003 said, "The new generation of artists and intellectuals in the Middle East are breaking the mold in creative circles. They reject all attempts to categorize them collectively and are as critical of the Western conception of the Orient as they are of the social conditions encountered in the region. The new art is political, one which reflects on moral values and the dominant religious and political codes. Arab artists and intellectuals ponder intensively over how to dismantle the West image of the Orient. Meanwhile, the stereotypical conceptions prevalent in the West live on." The statement provides a good general description of how the few examples of Arab art that reaches the West and I should qualify at this point that I will be using the word West here to mean the hegemonic powers of the US and Western Europe, are presented and perceived. What remains at the heart of all of these statements and others like them made in relation to the increasing number of exhibitions dedicated to the visual production of the Middle East or the Arab world is simply an obvious lack of knowledge of what is this contemporary art production. What is contemporary Arab art? How should it be analyzed, evaluated, critiqued? Simply, how should we write and talk about it, and what context does it fit in? The reasons behind this confusion stems from long years of refusing to acknowledge that the Arab world has contemporary art. Of course, issues of Orientalism and Euro-American centrism are still in the forefront. In fact, I argue of a new age Orientalism today, particularly in relation to the politics of representing Arab art. Kind of what Salwa Muqdadi spoke of in her talk last week. Unfortunately, the Arab world equally faces the same dilemma and confusion, as evident from the various discussions I've had so far with my students at Jordan University. شو هو الفن العربي المعاصر؟ شو هو الفن العربي أساساً؟ Thus, what I would like to address today is in essence the historical and theoretical base by which we can assess the visual production of today in the Arab world. I warn you, I have no answers, but instead I would like to pose some questions for discussions. موضوع يعني مش موضوع انه في جواب للسؤال، بس الموضوع مفروض انه احنا نفتح الحوار والنقاش عن الموضوع. I am taking the exhibition here at Darat al-Funun, Mona Hatoum and Salwa Muqdadi's talks as points of departure to construct a context from which and in which we can establish this discourse. How do we, or should we, look at our regional production? It seems to me that it is inevitable to look at today's art world within three separate, albeit at times overlapping spaces. On the one end, there is of course the established traditional Western space of production that has been dominant for the last 2 centuries or so. كلنا بنعرف تاريخ الفن الغربي الحمد لله يعني بس ما بنعرف تاريخنا. On the other end, there is the local scene that is largely struggling for acceptance. This is our local scene. And in between, there is the oscillating space of diaspora art, exile art. This is the space where, for example, we can locate the work of Mona Hatoum and most artists that Salwa Muqdadi spoke of in her talk. This third space of multi, at times unequal, layers has been once celebrated by most post-colonial writers and thinkers as the hope for inclusion, a way of including Arab art, in other words. It has been theorized as a space that is capable of protecting particularities, الخصوصيات, while claiming universality, العالمية. We do well to remember, however, Edward Said's analysis of universalism, a 16th century European concept used to justify colonization in the name of protecting or spreading universal values. Basically, a very similar argument used today by the United States administration for advancing universal democracy in Iraq. I don't think I need to tell you much about the huge blunder that turned out to be. My point here is that universal values, القيم العالمية, are always set by the hegemonic powers, and its essence embodies a leveling of the other. يعني لما بيكون القوى الأقوى هي اللي بتحط standards للقيم معناها احنا اللي مستضعفين او المهمشين احنا خارج هاي الايكويشن. Today I will concentrate on the latter two spaces, that of the Arab local scene and of diaspora as it relates to the Arab world. But to regress a bit. During the previous 2 decades, the discourse pertaining to Arab art, فن العربي, mostly talking here about the local scene, and yes, the term Arab is a term that needs qualification and reassessment, but I, as Salwa Muqdadi said, still believe in its validity, was dominated by and locked into a debate about the legitimacy of the term in regards to its existence and nature. In other words, the debate was delimited by this question: is there something called Arab art? Some argued, and still argue, this argument still exists here in Jordan, that Arab art is basically a continuation of Islamic aesthetics adapted to fit the modern age. Others claim that it is just an imitation, a derivative or a lesser quality version of Western art. While not necessarily in the center of the contemporary discourse for various reasons, this query is far from resolved and remains largely debatable in the Arab world, among Arab intellectuals, and in the West. An interesting example is the recent exhibition that was initiated in Damascus and traveled to Beirut and Cairo. Arab artists between Italy and the Mediterranean, was held in the domed 18th century Khan As'ad Pasha in Damascus. The exhibition pairs work of Arab artists with ones by Italian artists who are identified either as their teachers or source of inspiration. The result, the news report says, and I quote, is a powerful demonstration of how modern Arab artists adopted European styles and then transformed them to reflect the political turbulence of their countries. End of quote. The exhibition is equally used to highlight cultural exchanges in these difficult times when it is important for art to resist culture wars, said the researcher Martina Coniati. Interestingly, the exhibition is part of a series of events celebrating Damascus as this year's Arab capital of culture. But certainly it is not about benefiting from the new market's interest in modern Arab art. I specifically like the journalist's following statement. Taunting Western influence publicly is rare in Syria, which has been ruled by the nationalist Ba'ath Party since it took power in a coup 45 years ago and banned all opposition. The Ba'ath Party considers itself a bastion of Arabism, a secular creed with undertones of perceived cultural superiority. It is therefore highly unusual to argue, as did Syrian painter Fadi Yazigi, that Arab art may have remained confined to icons, calligraphy, and simplistic realism, were it not for the influences of Western art. Facing impressive governments which restricted public criticism, they turned to expressionism to depict ideas which people feared to declare openly. End of quote. Later in the same article, the journalist repeats what has become popular media-invented Arab art analysis since the invasion of Iraq in 2003, when Western media discovered Iraqi art and endeavored to understand it. He said, according to art experts, and I have no idea who these experts are, the repression of public criticism drove art so deeply into abstraction that it produced a powerful renaissance in Arab painting that would become quite different from the European styles which inspired it. This exhibition and the rhetoric used to promote it seems to tip the argument in favor of Western imitation side rather than the modern Islamic one. Nevertheless, one significant difference today is that the level and intensity and emphasis on this debate varies among Arab countries. Some would like to forget about this discussion altogether, while others are still kind of concentrating on it. Particularly as the notion of Arabism is now out of fashion. Some do actually argue its death and the triumph of regionalism. As I said earlier, I remain not completely convinced. While political Arabism is a thing of the past, I continuously see signs of a stronger cultural Arabism. Globalization, despite of, or because of its shortcomings, has only bridged the gap and enhanced opportunities for unity and solidarity. Central to my own research for my book, Modern Arab Art, Formation of Arab Aesthetics, has been the premise of a cultural unity in the modern Arab world, legitimizing the term Arab art, which I loosely define as a formulation of aesthetic that is distinctly modern and different than that of Islamic art. It embraces plurality of experiments and visions united by a conscious negotiation of cultural elements. I should also note that the definitions of modern versus contemporary in the Western scene are much more complex in the Arab world, in Arab art, in terms of time spans, but also there are no clear systems of knowledge, epistemological differences, يعني معرفي, as we perceive the relationship of the modern and its post in the West. At any rate, while I have just argued that the various Arab satellite TV networks have played an instrumental role in our global age to lessen the distance between al-Mashriq wal-Maghrib al-Arabi, 20th century visual production of the region had long preceded TV in presenting elements of Arab cultural unity. In my book, I have argued for an evident fundamental change in attitude towards the arts from the Islamic period, and that the change in modern Arab art is a change related to its aesthetics, not its forms only. I don't really want to repeat my argument, since you can read it in my book if you wish. I actually just gave Dar Tifnun a copy of it, so it is available. But the gist of that the gist of my argument is that modern and contemporary Arab arts are not an extension, a continuity, or a revival of the old Islamic forms of art, although do contain various elements of continuity, but rather they are innovative ways of Arab self-expressions formulated in response to their psychological and social motivations and the Arab intellectual understanding of the arts. While yes, the roots of modern Arab art are found in Western art, not Islamic art, the case is far from simple. However, to simplify, I would say, as occurred in the formation of Islamic art, modern Arabs were confronted by a complex visual system which they admired. With the shift of power in the modern age to the West, Arabs were consumed in the process of identity assertion and new states formation. It was a time of uncertainty and re-evaluation of culture, history, and tradition. Learning and imitating Western art, has been argued, was a necessary step for Arab artists to deal with the lack of artistic creativity they faced. Yet Arab artists rapidly surpassed this stage and endeavored to search for an art which could represent their identities and national consciousness. This discontent led them to modern art, which in turn forced them to realize their own artistic inheritance, as it offered them a modern model of non-representational art with roots in their own heritage, through which they can attempt to reconcile their present with their past. In accordance to their new vision of the world, they selectively appropriated signs, forms, and techniques from their long history as well as from the West. The tension between figurative and abstract art continues still today in the Arab world, actually in the world as in general, for various reasons. Figurative art became a tradition rooted in the public taste despite its short history in modern Arab art. Arabs would accept the two-dimensionality of Islamic ornamentation as a form of traditional decoration, but would reject the formal vocabulary of non-representational Western art, even following the death of naturalism advocated by the West. There are نقاشات طويلة أنا يعني كل يوم عندي مع طلابي بالصف، كيف بدنا نعرف هذا، هل هو فن ولا مش فن، ليش هذا فن. This change in aesthetics generated a number of other challenges that are yet to be resolved. The main problematic of Arab art since the second half of the 20th century has been in defining its Arabness. How could Arab artists produce an art that would be fundamentally Arabic? كيف نعمل فن عربي? And I might add that this is something that is still asked of contemporary art from the Arab world even today in all exhibitions around the world. From its inception, Arab art had to battle the discourse of a national identity during the 1950s and 60s, and then in the 70s the call for asala. Asala is generally used by Arabs to denote a style of vision, attitude, and production situated in the past, and accordingly always be held in opposition to modernity. أصالة وحداثة ما بيمشوا مع بعضهم. The fear of deculturation intensified the search for authenticity. The new modernized, westernized conformity that mostly governs Arab cultures today is still perceived as decadent and inauthentic. This authenticity is sought by reference to the inherited culture, which translates to heritage, turath, which was reinvented and consisted of isolated appropriations based on a misunderstanding of the past and not continuity. Tradition intensifies in opposition to ideas accompanying foreign merchandise or a universally decried liberalism, something that we are still suffering from today. لساتنا بنعاني من نفس المشكلة. That is essentially what impels Arabs to cling to their past and what makes history the more imperative. In reality, Arab peoples have been living somewhere between the past and the future, but not in the present. They seem to only remember the glories of their past, golden age, or dream about a better and happier future. Western theories explain it as their failure, the Arabs' failure to attain modernity. In other words, the Arabs' alternative modernity, or their own understanding of modernity, has not been recognized or acknowledged. Consequently, Arab art is seen by a larger number of Arab intellectuals, art critics in the Arab world and in the West as nothing but an offshoot of Western art. This state of oscillation, back and forth, between the past and the present, nevertheless, becomes precisely the Arabs' nature. Thus, their arts cannot find unity. The problem in wanting to identify a unity in Arab art today is that such a quest neglects the nature of contemporary art altogether. Today's art is governed only by its own rules and defies classification and conformity. The history of contemporary art, as well as progress in art, consists of the totality of individual efforts, each defining its own understanding of art and beauty. This is precisely the nature of modern contemporary Arab art today. The collective self, the social totality, is the Arab people. Similar to the situation in Europe, modern art was rejected by the people for its idealism. A good example, the renowned Jawad Salim, hailed today for his achievements, was denounced during his life as an enemy of the people. Acceptance of works of art in Arab societies is still conditioned by the public's taste. The public expects art to correspond to its needs, not to surpass reality and the norms. Arabs' historical obsession with the collective self has resulted on many occasions in Turath as kitsch, the artistic creation which materializes that which society is incapable of and defies the prevailing taste, is seen as a counter-narrative that challenges totalizing national essentialist identities. Adding to this disconnect between artists and masses here is the lack of an infrastructure in form of art education and art criticism. Professional art criticism in the Arab world remains rare. Arab art critics are generally either literary critics or artists themselves, and in either case are not trained in the language of visual criticism. Journalism also plays a negative role through the daily published reviews of exhibitions and artists. With the absence of a history of Arab art criticism, or a history of Arab art for that matter, Western models are the only available ones. The lack of an objective art criticism further contributes to the conflict between tradition and modernity, and is the reason behind starting a long debate concerning the role of the artist. Is he a witness to what is new in his age or her age, or a transporter of the traditions of her culture? هلا يعني في مجموعة من الفنانين المعاصرين بيقولوا إنه أصلاً هذا الحوار, the debate, the discourse of modernity and the past, الماضي والحاضر, صار شيء من التاريخ, شيء من الماضي, إنه اليوم ما بيعنيهم بهن بالبرودكشن الفنية تاعيتهم. أنا المشكلة اللي بلاقيها إنه إذا إحنا ما حلينا المشاكل اللي كانت موجودة من بداية القرن العشرين ووسط القرن العشرين, من غير ممكن إنه نتوصل إلى معرفة الفن اللي بينتج اليوم. The issue of art criticism is in fact only part of a larger one, that of the field of art education, aesthetics and valuation of art. Aesthetics, the science of beauty, as an academic or cultural field, has no place in the Arab world. Despite few serious Arab studies, research in Islamic aesthetics is still the domain of Western scholars. There are only a few isolated studies by Arab historians and critics about the nature of contemporary Arab aesthetics that are mainly conducted in the West, with limited access to artists and art productions in the Arab world. That includes me as well. Art education, where available, still follows 19th century European model. In the Arab world, there is little distinction between art as a profession and art as a hobby. Valuation is non-existent. Thus, today's local Arab markets are dominated by mediocre copies of Orientalist work to cater to the taste of the bourgeois class, or by equally mediocre works of the popular Hurufiyya current, the so-called modern calligraphic works, accepted by the religiously inclined. Most professional Arab artists are able to gain stature outside their countries only through international exhibition and migration. That, of course, does not negate the fact that we have a tremendous number of incredible incredibly mature experiments in our market, but I'm talking about the generality. بصورة عامة الماركت خصوصا مش بالضبط هون بالأردن بس بالوطن العربي بصورة عامة. Arab societies demand that their artists define an Arab cultural identity in accordance to the prevailing national rhetoric. The debate also undermines many successful experiments by Arab artists who have achieved a form of reconciliation between the self and the other, actually an achievement that we cannot even claim that Western artists have done, through juxtaposing and synthesizing the positive aspects from the other, and through engaging with both tradition and modern Western art. They trust that their individual visions and styles cannot but reflect their Arabness. Their asala, thus, is expressed in their original approach to the problems of their environment. These artists were able to realize in their work not only a unique individual style, but actually an Arab aesthetic which aimed at expressing the social dynamics of their people. Today, however, new developments take place in the Arab world and new art centers are created. The decade of the 1990s witnessed the development of art markets in the Arab world for reasons that differed from one country to the other. Amman is a city that had to become host to a large number of displaced Iraqi artists, as well as provide exhibition spaces to replace ones from neighboring countries incapacitated by political instabilities and wars during the 1980s and 90s. In the last 2 decades, Amman was transformed into a vital and lively cultural center in the Arab region. The political instability of the region, along with the intensified instability of Arab Muslim presence in the West as a consequence of the ideology of the war on terror, has all contributed to Amman's cultural growth, as it provided one of the few safe havens in the midst of a very chaotic sector of the region. With both Beirut and Baghdad unavailable in the 90s, and with Cairo's perceived stagnation at the time, because of its geographical centrality, as well as important initiatives such as Darat al-Funun, Amman became the fertile ground for various cultural activities and exhibitions. At the same time, the role of wealthy Gulf states in providing an important and lucrative market for artists from other Arab countries increased, particularly as they developed their galleries and organized international events like the Sharjah Biennale and Dubai Art Festival. In response, certain Arab cities had to quickly develop mostly a haphazard art infrastructure to both cater to the local development as well as become a mechanism of connection with and production for other Arab art centers like those of the Gulf region. The results thus far of globalization in the Arab world have been the creation of 2 distinct levels of production and markets in the visual art. Some artists have achieved limited international recognition and produce works for the world market. The consequence is often, but not always, that they relocate to the West and or generate a rift between their work and the local public. يعني ذوقياً عن الجمهور. In turn, a new local style and taste are developed. The new local style is also formed through contact and engagement with more mature art experiments of various Arab artists, many of whom are currently residing in Europe and thus bring with them their own understanding of globalization. The majority of artists, however, and for various reasons, produce for the local markets, with little or no concern for the international criteria. The duality of art scene is a relatively new trend and is directly connected to the emergence of a worldwide concern for art on the one Western side, and the adoption of new languages and media of expression by some artists in the Arab world. Traditional works of art shown in galleries all over the Middle East are generally still evaluated by the West as conforming to a local taste, and in accordance to its established international standards, judged as backward. This local taste, however, is in fact expressive of Arab aesthetics. The disparity of style and media is easily perceived between works of art displayed in locally organized exhibitions and Arab art exhibited at Western organized ones, such as the 3 stages of contemporary Arab representations curated by Catherine David. There was Beirut, Cairo, and then the Iraqi equation. You're seeing image from the Iraqi equation. اللي صار إنه كاترين دافيد نفسها كانت يعني متفاجئة ليش إنه بالبلدان اللي المعرض انعرض بالقاهرة وببيروت، طبعا العراقي إكويجن كان ببرلين وببرشلونة، فيعني العراق ما كان ببغداد مع إنه هي كان أملها إنه تعمله ببغداد. بس كانت متفاجئة ليش إنه الشعب نفسه الحضور العربي ما كان يعني متفاعل مع المعارض. أكبر سبب لهذا طبعا إنه أصلا الجمهور كان بيشوف غير أعمال فنية بالجاليريز اللي موجودة عندهم عن اللي كان معروض بهذه exhibitions. People's interest in visual arts in the Arab world has generally grown. While attending gallery openings is prestigious, regularly visiting museums of modern art where available and acquiring works of art has not become the norm for the great majority of the people. It has certainly become common for the elite. Meanwhile, war in the Middle East, war in the Middle East has been by far the foremost motive behind world recognition of modern and contemporary art from the Arab world during the last 2 decades. Particularly if these works were fortunate enough to fit within the framework of globalization. Walid Raat and Akram Zaatari from Lebanon, Amelie Jasser and Khalil Rabah from Palestine are today well-known names within the art circles in the United States and Europe. Contemporary Lebanese art has in fact found a wider recognition following the end of the civil war and the new political development. Significantly, the Lebanese artists known in the West have been mostly trained in the USA, and they speak fluent English and they're very comfortable with all the new media, and returned to Beirut at the end of the civil war to spearhead a contemporary art movement that negotiates the realities of the war and its aftermath. Similarly, Palestinian artists known in the West are mostly a young generation of artists living and working in between the West and Palestine. The situation is admittedly different with Iraq. After a decade and a half of sanctions and isolation, the world forgot about Iraq and its art during the 1990s, including to some extent within the region itself. While a number of Iraqi artists settled in Jordan, they were, however, more connected to Iraq than the rest of the world. The few who settled in Europe and beyond struggled to survive and assimilate within their host countries or continued to work in isolation. Following 2003, the world not only remembered Iraq, but gained much interest and searched for contemporary Iraqi art. Unlike the generation of globalized Lebanese and Palestinian artists that I just mentioned, Iraqi artists were largely trained in Iraq and left only after reaching their artistic maturity. Most were still working within the modernist paradigm of abstraction and even formalism. Only recently, and after a new generation of Iraqi artists who settled and trained in the West, did a couple of young Iraqi artists provoke the interest of mainstream art establishment. هو حلو الواحد يعطي محاضرة بالطبيعة، بس then you have to battle with all the elements that are around you. Only recently and after a new generation of Iraqi artists who settled and trained in the West, did a couple of young Iraqi artists provoke the interest of mainstream art establishment and the attention of media. After exhibiting in the Venice Biennale, Adil Abdin's travel agency is fast becoming a favorite in the USA. And actually, it is a big project of an installation, a videotape, and brochures that are all, and actually he had a website where you can get online and reserve a ticket to go visit Baghdad, the experience of almost going as a tourist to Baghdad with everything that Baghdad promises to give, but of course not available. It's very sarcastic work. And Wafa Bilal, who is known for his provocative interactive video installations, such as the interactive online project of Domestic Tension Shoot at an Iraqi. Bilal locked himself into a studio with live webcams for the month of May 2006, where the public can watch him 24 hours, 7 days a week, over a live webcam. And if they chose, visitors to his website were able to shoot him with a remote-controlled paintball gun. Evidently, both artists have adapted to a new language of globalized art. Their themes are obviously centered on the war. Their negotiations and commentary on the state of Iraq today methodologically fall in the same category of the post-war Lebanese artist. Of course, the problematic of trying to understand postmodern Arab art, as I suppose the examples mentioned above would be classified, is only magnified by the previous debates and splits I discussed thus far. Moreover, without refuting modernity's claim of superior Western origins, the postmodern and the postcolonial world today is dominated by two unequal historiographic discourses, aiming at creating historical meaning. في عنا on the one end, those of the post-national, postmodern, postcolonial, and ultimately the transnational, يعني اللي مرتفعين فوق الهوية, and those of the pre-national, pre-modern, and pre-colonial. The globalized post celebrates displacement and transcendence of origin, إنه ما في هوية محددة وإنما عالمية. While the pre urgently seeks meaning through the return to the pre-colonial, the pre-modern, the pre-nationalist traditions. Yet globalism and postmodernism specifically ask the marginalized, المهمشين, to abandon identity, تخلي عن الهوية, while both notions epistemologically cling to the return to nationalism. And so today, the homogenizing forces of globalization have replaced those of modernization in pushing the underdeveloped or developing, whichever you want to call it, parts of the world into a stronger chauvinist nationalism as a way of battling for their existence. يعني كنا we were struggling with modernism بالقرن العشرين, هلا بدنا to struggle with globalization بالقرن ال21. Postmodernism did not abolish the meta-narrative. إنه هي حكاية كبيرة كلنا ضمنها مثل ما كان modern الحداثة يعني بتقول, or deconstruct the binary of the West and the rest, but rather only succeeded in endorsing Western regionalities as the dominant universals. Fundamental in engaging with any discourse claiming a postmodern system of knowledge is an acknowledgement of a modern past, thus making it impossible for an other, historically deprived and excluded from modernity, to become postmodern. The postmodern world is still explained through Western theories and continuing the modernist essentializing paradigm by laundering the guilt of Eurocentrism through minimizing the past to the point of forgetfulness. To return to the issue of diaspora artists. From my perspective as an art historian of Arab art located in the West, I find the acceptance of the above-mentioned artists, Lebanese, the Palestinian, the Iraqis, and other nationalities, in the West as a form of continuation of the Orientalist paradigm. For example, in this exhibition you're looking at that is on screen, the introductory essay to Beyond East and West, 7 Transnational Artists, exhibitions catalog, David O'Brien presents the participating artist as borderline artist. Borderline artist, a term that Homi Bhabha actually argued for, which means that they are from here and there, من هون ومن هناك, generally displaced, living in between two cultures. They have trespassed political, cultural, and religious borders and have disrupted the norms. Their art is seen as a chance for better intercultural understandings. What O'Brien describes is the new ideal of a hybrid, globalized artist. Hybridity and its hyphenated identities, Arab American, Iranian American, Arab British, have certainly become the accepted form of the other in the West. But one cannot ignore the fact that the artists are specifically asked to explain and make their cultures accessible. Their art is thus asked to express the clarity and clarify its identity and politics. I'm going to, for the sake of time, jump ahead. And because I'm sure you guys, Bardanin. What I qualify as 2 specific token inclusion moments that seem to be the preferred manifestations of postmodernist thought in the world of art needs much evaluation before they are celebrated. One is the acceptance of a representative number of artists of Arab origin, They fall in two camps. One is artists who represent gender issues, generally female artists with Islamic or Arabic backgrounds, artists that Salwa Maqdadi spoke of in her presentation, who specifically exemplified the West obsession with the veil, such as the American-Iranian Tshireen Neshat and the American-Egyptian Ghada Amr. And artists who articulate issues related to politics and war, like the examples I mentioned before. The second moment is the welcoming of a modern non-Western art, Arab, Iranian, and Indian, in the global art scene as epitomized by the recent interest in the field and the newly developed market value courtesy of Christie's and Sotheby's auctions. Works of art by artists from different parts of the Arab world were sold for high prices, actually mostly unrealistically high prices, and have since become in demand on an international level. These two moments raise a number of questions. Is Christie's move an indication of the global value of contemporary art produced in the Arab world, Iran or India? Has the art world finally acknowledged or accepted non-Western visual works as art and not a political statement or a gender statement? Are Middle Eastern artists free from the burden of identity in their contemporary work? If they are supposed to become transnational, to trespass the borders, then are they able to not negotiate their Arab identity and express their Arab cultures? Few efforts notwithstanding, the rising monetary value, قيمة الأعمال, from the Middle East in auctions is hardly contributing to a better understanding of its aesthetics, nor allowing it an equal space in the global art world. On the contrary, reception of work by women artists from Muslim backgrounds or works that fall within the new category of art and war in the West exemplifies the opposite, flattening the rich and complex visual meanings of the works to conform to Western expectations of issues of gender and politics has in most cases only contributed to increasing their Western commercial value, but not contributed anything to understanding their own aesthetics. The veil has been an enduring fetish in Western, أعمال لشيرين نشأت وغادة عمر. The veil has been an enduring fetish in Western Orientalist art, always a signifier of repression. Western audiences were obsessed to see what was hidden behind it. It was an absolute binary separating East and West. It evoked, however, fantasy, exoticism, and desire. Following September 11, 2001, the veil became a signifier of Muslim aggression against the West. A shift in Western gaze from that of desire to that of fear only solidifies the binary, and is what allowed for the acceptance of art directly related to politics, war, and destruction as representative of the Arab world. In other words, at the end, I still don't know what exactly is contemporary Arab art, or how do we qualify works that have been produced by diaspora artists as Arab art, or do we qualify them as that? In that, I would like your help. Thank you very much. بس إذا في ضوء عشان أنا واقفة عم بحكي ومش شايفة وش ولا حدا, and it's really weird, يعني it's a very weird experience to talk to an infinity.
هلا بضوي. احنا شايفين.
نظام أمني شوي.
نظام أمني. I expect at least طلابي يكون عندهم أسئلة وملاحظات يعني. مش شايفة ما هو. تفضل.
في مايك نحكي ولا على الفن؟ طيب يعني حقيقة في مجمل المحاضرة في كثير من الأسئلة اللي ممكن واحد يطرحها، بس حقيقة حاولت استجمع بعض النقاط الرئيسية. أولا ما شدني أنه ألقيت المحاضرة باللغة الإنجليزية في حين الحديث عن الفن في الوطن العربي.
هذا تقصير مني.
لا هو ليس تقصير، يعني لا أقصد الاتهام، ولكن قصدي إنه يعني هل في مشكلة باللغة العربية لتستوعب خطاب الحداثة أو ما بعد الحداثة؟
يعني أنا بحب I'm trying to be diplomatic وأحط اللوم علي أنا. هو لا أنا عارفة المشكلة باللغة مش مشكلة الحداثة وما بعد الحداثة، المشكلة إنه نتكلم بلغة عربية عن الفن. هلا لما احنا كل المكتوب عندنا عن الفن سابقا اذا كنا بنحكي كتابات بالعهد الاسلامي مكتوبه بلغه مختلفه تماما. اليوم استيعابنا للغه العربيه اختلف. يعني انا ممكن احكي عن نفسي انه انا لغتي خصوصا الفصحى مثلا يعني اصعب، يعني صعب علي اني اعرف يعني استخدمها منيح، بس انا عم بلاقي هاي المشكله مش بس عندي، عند الجميع.
يعني اصبح بحاجه لتطوير اللغه النقديه العربيه لتنسجم مع اللغه البصريه او طرح يعني الحدث. هاي النقطه الاولى اللي حاب كنت يعني بدي طرح. النقطه الثانيه حقيقه لها علاقه بالفرق ما بين مفهوم الفن الاسلامي والفن العربي، على اعتبار انه الفن الاسلامي هو فن جامع للفن العربي والفارسي والبربري والى اخره. فيعني هل ثمة تحس في تقصير تجاهنا في فهمنا لهذا يعني لهالمصطلحين؟ الفن العربي المنطلق من البعد القومي، يعني هو بلش الحديث عن الفن العربي انطلاقا من الابحاث اللي اخذت تهتم بالبعد القومي العربي، اللي هي بدايات القرن العشرين نهايات القرن التاسع عشر. ف يعني هل ثمة لبس في فهمنا لهي
بين الفن الاسلامي والفن العربي
بشكل عام والفن العربي؟ كون في دراسات كثيره تتحدث عن انه الفن العربي احتوى الفن التشخيصي، يعني الفن العربي ليس كما يقال هو فن ابستراكت.
لما عم تحكي عن الفن العربي عم تحكي عن الفن القومي ولا الفن الاسلامي هلا؟
لا، الفن العربي في الوطن العربي.
حاليا
ذلك يعني قصير اسمه عمرة وفي رسومات وفي دراسات مهمه كثير عن هذا الموضوع اللي بتحكي عن الفن التشخيصي سواء في النحت في البتراء او في يعني هاي نقطتين كان ودي يعني اذا في
هي بالحقيقه يعني هاي النقطتين انا بتعمق فيهم بكتابي، بس هو اساسا يعني باختصار فيني اقول لك انه الفن الاسلامي لا يزال غير مفهوم، مش بس هون بالبلاد العربيه وبالغرب، لا يزال ينظر اليه كانه هو فن يعني ماينر ارت، ديكوريتيف ارت، زخرفي، انه الفلسفه تاعته لسه مش مفهومه. والغريب انه مبادئ الفن الحديث هي اكشلي نفسها مبادئ الفن الاسلامي بس 13 قرن قبل الفن الحديث. فيعني في اسباب كثيره هلا يعني ما بدي ادخلها ليش في سوء لفهمه، بس احنا مشكلتنا اللي صايره هون اي ثينك انه احنا معتمدين على دراسات الغربيه بصوره عامه بنترجمها. انا بطلع هون بالمكتبات بشوف انه بصوره عامه اي دراسه عن الفن الاسلامي يعني شو اسمه الاكسبشن في 2 3 يعني ثروت عكاشة، عفيف بهنسي اللي كتبوا، بس كمان مصادرهم المعتمده هي من الغرب. فاذا احنا بالضبط باعتمادهم على الاستشراق، فاذا معناه انه احنا لازم نرجع نعيد تقييم الفن الاسلامي نفهمه حتى نعرف كيف ننطلق منه. اذا احنا اعتمادنا على اعمال المستشرقين، وهلا يعني اعتقد انه صارت واضحه انه الاستشراق فيه ايديولوجيه معينه، يعني ايديولوجيه ممكن تكون سياسيه عدائيه كيف ما بدنا نفسرها، فاذا احنا ما فينا ناخذها على فيس فاليو يعني انه هذا هو بحث معتمد. فهي مشكله الاشكاليه اللي موجوده من ناحيه الفن الاسلامي. بعدين جينا نقطه طبعا يعني لا يزال العالم يقول لك انه كيف عندكم رسم تشخيصي بالوطن العربي، مش هذا ضد الاسلام، مش الاسلام ضد الرسم التشخيصي. وغير قصير عمرو وغيرهم مقامات الحريري والمانuscripts الكثير اللي موجوده عندنا تدل على انه هذا ما كان صحيح، بس كان في طريقه معينه للتشخيص هي مختلفه عن الطريقه اللي كانت معتمده بالغرب. هلا على فكره في دراسات جديده بتقول انه اصلا البرسبكتيف المنظور الرياضي هو ما كان اكتشاف او يعني كونستراكشن بالغرب بايطاليا بالرينيسانس مثل ما احنا يعني فاكرين، مثل ما احنا متعلمين، وانما في دراسات جديده بتدل على انه بين الصين والبلدان الاسلاميه كان في كل المبادئ تاعيتها. اذا كان هذا صحيح فهو دليل وقت. وفي انا مره بالصدفه لقيت يعني رسمه معينه وندمان كثير اني ما I didn't save it يعني اسلاميه من كانت قرن 11 او القرن العاشر، فيها المنظور، فيها برسبكتيف، يعني تاريخها قبل المنظور في عصر النهضه في الرينيسانس. اذا معناها اذا كان هذا صحيح، وبغض النظر اذا كان هذا صحيح او لا، انه هو كان رافض منطقي للمنظور من قبل الفن الإسلامي، مش لأنه مثلا ما بيعرفوا يرسموه بس، وإنما لأنه هن أسبابهم وأهدافهم في التشخيص مختلفة تماما. عندنا اكزامبلز كثيرة، عندنا نماذج كثيرة عن كيف كانوا بيشخصوا الفرد، كيف يرسموا الشخص، يعني شو الأشياء اللي مسموحة ومش مسموحة من خلال يعني التعاليم الإسلامية، واللي هي مش بالذات necessarily تعاليم دينية وإنما تعاليم حضارية، أعراف وتعاليم حضارية. يعني أولي جرابار مثلا بكتابه Formation of Islamic Art بيناقش نقطة مهمة كتير، إنه بنظره رفض الإسلام للتصوير هو مش رفض سببه ديني وإنما سببه سياسي. لما طلعوا للدولة البيزنطية والدول الثانية وشافوا موقع ومعنى التصوير في هذه الدول، قرروا هن يعني consciously قرروا شعوريا قرروا احنا ما بدنا نعمل هذا نفس الشيء، خصوصا انه في تعاليم دينيه ايوه ممكن لها يعني بتضارب معها. فهي من ناحيه يعني هذا موضوع طويل ونقاش كثير بده كتاب ثاني، بس يعني كيف اثر علينا مثلا بالوقت بالزمن الحديث لفهم الفن العربي. المشكله اللي صار لحد اليوم بالمعارض عالميا، هلا انا ذكرت انه مثلا اكرم زعتري او خليل رباح، إيميلي جاسر يعني قبلوا عالميا كفنانين، لكن هن دائما ما مثلا ما يقال عن اي واحد منهم فنان. حتى شيرين نشأت اللي صارها بامريكا وبنيويورك 20 سنه او اكثر حتى من 20 سنه، لا ينظر اليها كفنانه امريكيه، وانما ينظر اليها كفنانه ايرانيه امريكيه، وبيتكوا اكثر على الايراني، يعني هي اكثر ايرانيه منها امريكيه. والحق قال اذا شيرين نشأت بطلت ترسم نساء لابسين عبايات ما حدا بده شغلها، وفي يعني اكزامبلز على هذا. معناها انه هن قولبوا الفن حتى اللي في المعاصر اللي عم يطلع من الفنانين اللي اصولهم عربيه بقالب معين. قابلين الفن المعاصر اذا كان هو كريتيك اوف جندر بيناقش موضوع المراه وامور المراه، او السياسي خصوصا الدمار هلا والحروب. اذا بنطلع على الفنانين اللي انقبلوا من البلدان العربيه، لبنان، فلسطين والعراق، معناها احنا عم نحكي عن دول في وضع حرب. هلا on the other side الجهه الثانيه في السوق ساذبيز وكريستيز، بس ما في علاقه بين هدول الاثنين، بين السوق التجاريه اللي عم تصير بالاوكشنز وبين المعارض اللي عم تصير بالميوزيوم اوف مودرن ارت in نيويورك ولا التيت جاليري بلندن. السوق عم يبيع بصوره خاصه في البلدان العربيه، مش عم يبيع باوروبا او بالغرب. الاعمال الاسعار اللي عم تجيبها اللوحات العربيه عم تجيبها في البلدان العربيه ومن الاشخاص اللي بيشتروها عرب او ايرانيين او هنود. فاذا في انقطاع بين هدول الاثنين. لا تزال فكرة انه الفن العربي كل ما بيشوفوا فن عربي، هلا الفن اللي بيطلع من العراق في مجموعة كبيرة من المعارض للفن العراقي هلا عم تصير لاسباب كثيرة، منها انه مساعدة للفنان العراقي، منها انه ان اكنولجمنت الدور الامريكي، بس بصورة عامة شو بدهم اكشلي رسومات زيتية أو مائية لمشاحيف لمناظر طبيعية، لأنه هذا المفروض يكون الفن العراقي، مش مفروض يكون غير هيك. طبعا احنا بنعرف كثير منيح انه استاذ رافع الناصري قاعد حدك ما بيعمل مشاحيف وشو اسمه ونخل، فاذا معناها في فكره معينه انه هو العالم بيتقبل الفن العربي من خلالها. ما بعرف اذا جاوبت سؤالك ولا طرحت 50 سؤال ثاني.
بس يعني في جواب اسمه السؤال الثالث اللي هو شو اسمه له علاقه بفن الايقونه المسيحيه، اللي هي على اعتبار انه ممكن تكون الى حد ما تاسيس ما للوحه المعلقه او اللوحه المحموله زي ما بسموها. يعني لماذا كثيرا ما يغفل الفن الايقونه المسيحيه اللي هي موجوده في الكنائس، واللي كان موجوده في اكثر شيء في لبنان وفي فلسطين، لانه في يعني نسبه مرجعيه مسيحيه كبيره. ف يعني قلما يتم الحديث عن الايقونه المسيحيه باعتبار انها ايضا مرجعيه للوحه الحداثيه يعني العربيه او اللوحه المحموله، اللي احنا دائما بنحكي انه هي لوحه فقط مأخوذه من الغرب. يعني صحيح انه الالوان الزيتيه يعني اختراع اساسا صيني، تكنولوجيا، وهو اختراع صيني مش اختراع اوروبي يعني،
بس هذه ماده تكنولوجيا،
بس هي ماده، بس هي ايضا في تقاليد اللوحه الزيتيه موجوده ما قبل يعني ما قبل
القرن العشرين. بالضبط. ما هو المشكله مثل ما قلت يعني انه مين بيكتب التاريخ وكيف بينكتب التاريخ، هاي مشكلتنا. لكن تفضل اياد انت حضرتك تعمل دراسه عن الموضوع.
شو اسمه شربل داغر، يعني
شربل داغر عمل ايوه
اللوحه.
نعم
الصوره واللوحه في كان تحدث عن فن.
صح مضبوط مضبوط.
بدي اولا اعدل معلومتين عندي. واحده في صوره اجت لمحمود سعيد مكتوب دانسر ميوزيكال، هي بنات بحري وليس دانسر.
بالانجليزي كيف بدنا نترجمها؟
لا بنات بحري معروف الملامح المصريه.
مظبوط بس لا
اللي في النص انا رسمتها 5 سنين اسمها فوزي.
شكرا.
معلومه ثانيه قلت فيها معلومه خطيره انه التجديد الاسلامي والتجديد الاوروبي واحد. لا، التجديد الاوروبي من الاغريق للان هو تجديد مادي. التجديد الاسلامي من بدايه الوحده الجغرافيه الاسلاميه لحد الان تجديد روحي. انما قضيه التجريد في اللي تكلمتوا عنه قصير عمره والواسطي، هذه قضيه يا ستي اصلا مش قصور فيهم. سوري خلينا مش قصور فيهم في ما بيعرفوش اسمه بيرسبكتيف. هم لجأوا كحل بديل عشان قضيه الحلال والحرام، فجردوا ووسطوا، خلوا الشباب يوسط. هذه قضيه عاليه. ويوجد في قصير عمره منظور لوني ومنظور روحي، وكان باستطاعتهم يعملوا منظور ذي ثاني. قصير عمره سبق الفنانين الاوروبيين ب 1400 عام. انا عملت بحث عنه في التعبيريه والتجريديه والرمزيه و فيعني قضيه.
انا متفقه معك يعني
انا متفق معك. وشكرا لهالمحاضره الحلوه.
شكرا.
مرحبا. بس عندي استفسار، هل الدياسبورا ارت هو عبارة عن انطلاق للبوست مودرن ارت ارب ارت؟ وهل لو ان نحن تخلينا عن الماضي كان احنا كارب ارتست عن ماضينا، هل انه هذا يعتبر انه ستيب جديد في البوست مودرن ارت، ولا انه لازم نتعلق في الماضي بس بطريقة جديدة، يعني في ابتكار لوحات جديدة؟
هلا سؤالك الاول كان هل الدياسبورا ارت انطلاق للبوست مودرن ارت من الفن لا، في تجارب كثير ممكن تعتبر بوست مودرنست ارت هون بالوطن العربي قبل الدياسبورا ارت، بس هي مفهوم البوست مودرنزم او مفهوم المودرنزم كان مختلف، او طريقه التفاعل معه. في اسباب تاريخيه وصلت العالم الغربي للمودرنزم بالطريقه اللي هن توصلوا لها، ما كانت موجوده او مش محتاجينها احنا بالوطن العربي. مثلا من اهم مبادئ الحداثه في العالم الغربي هو الانقطاع مع الماضي. هاي شغله احنا ما كنا مضطرين نعملها، انه الانقطاعهم عن الماضي كان انقطاع عن الماديه لتحول نوعا ما الى الروحيه، مثل زي ما الاستاذ كان عم يتفضل يحكي هلا قبل شوي. طب احنا هاي المشكله ما كانت موجوده عندنا اساسيا، فلشو مثلا لازم احنا نمشي على نفس هذا المنطلق؟ فاذا كانت اعمال الحداثه او اعمال ما بعد الحداثه في الوطن العربي هي منطلقه من قواعد أو أسس يعني تاريخية واجتماعية إلها علاقة بالبلد نفسه، ممكن يكون العمل مختلف جدا، بس هو الحقيقة ممكن يكون العمل كمان مش مختلف. بال 2003 بعد الاحتلال، احتلال العراق، رحت على بغداد، رحت على جاليريز. كان صار احنا لنا تقريبا يعني 10 سنين أو 13 سنة من السانكشنز يعني، ما عندنا اي معلومات بتطلع من الفن عن الفن من العراق. لما رحت، والمفروض انه هن كمان جوا منقطعين تماما عن العالم، لما رحت وشفت الاعمال اللي عم يعملوها اكتشفت انه ما بعد الحداثه ومفهومها هو موجود في العراق حتى بانقطاعهم عن العالم. ومن اهم مبادئ ما بعد الحداثه والعولمه هو التواصل، بس مع الانقطاع اللي كان موجود هم ذهنيا معناها تاريخيا في اسباب تاريخيه، اسباب لها علاقه في تغير الزمان، تغير الحياه، انه وصلتهم الى نتائج انه المبادئ مختلفة. ممكن المبادئ تكون مختلفة بس النتيجة فيها تقارب. أما عملية إنه هل لازم الفنان العربي يترك ماضيه أو ما يترك ماضيه، يعني سؤال تجريدي. كيف الإنسان يترك ماضيه؟ يعني شو يترك ماضيه؟ هي عملية التفاعل بالماضي، مش عملية، أو التفاعل مع الماضي، مش عملية تتركه أو ما تتركه. كيف الواحد يعني يتواصل بس يتقدم كمان.
عندي سؤال ثاني، هل انه المودرن ارت هو عباره انه كيف انه نحن نلاقي اساليب جديده في التعبير عن الفن،
هل انه يعتبر بوست مودرن ارت انه نحن عم نحاول نرجع نتواصل مع الاساليب اللي نحن ابتكرناها او توصلنا اليها كفنانين عرب، في انه يعني نرجع للماضي تاعنا ونبتكر اشياء جديده؟ يعني هل يعتبر مودرن ارت انه نحن بنحاول نعمل شيء جديد، والبوست مودرن نرجع لهذا الشيء للماضي تاعنا بس باسلوب كمان ثاني؟
الفن دائما عن التجديد، ما في فن بدون تجدد. دائما الفن بيعبر عن طريقة بيعطي شغلة جديدة بيعبر عنها بطريقة جديدة. التجدد دائما موجود. اللي حصل بالحداثة بالغرب كان أسباب معينة، إنه في شغلة جديدة كتير، خصوصا industrial revolution political revolutions، فكان في سبب لإلهم إنهم بدهم يغيروا مسارهم تغيير جذري. ما بعد الحداثة صار إنه كرياكشن للحداثة خصوصا بالغرب. نعم نحكي إحنا من منطلق غربي، مش عم نحكي منطلق هون، لأنه يعني الموضوع كله بيختلف لما عم نحكي من هون. ما فينا نقول إنه واحد يعني يدور عن تجدد والثاني يدور عن إعادة الماضي. هو اللي صار الانقطاع عن الماضي مع الحداثة خلى ما بعد الحداثة as a reaction إنه يقولوا لا إحنا ليش لا نترك الماضي والتاريخ، بدنا نرجع، بس طريقة الانتقاء التاريخ مختلفة. خلاص بردتوا صار لازم تروحوا. شكرا كثير.
نشكر الدكتورة ندى على هذه المحاضرة القيمة التي ألقت بظلالها على العديد من الأسئلة الإشكالية حول المعاصرة في الفن بالبلاد العربية، ونشكر لكم حضوركم على أن نلتقي إن شاء الله الثلاثاء القادم مع فيلم حتى متى لدانا أبو رحمة ومن إنتاج أن ماري جاسر. شكرا لحضوركم مرة أخرى. مساء الخير.